Matrubhyo Namaha, Pitrubhyo Namaha, Gurubhyo Namaha, Sabhai Namaha, Sabhapatibhyascha Namo Namaha. Very good morning to all of you and Namaskar to all of you. It's a great pleasure to be here in this conference talking about Bharatiya view on sustainability, and if I may be this thing to add resilience as well. These are the concepts that are at the core of many discussions, policy making, and all of these things across the world today. And I wanted to present what is a Bharatiya view on that. And then basically part of that, I come from the land of Mahakavi Kalidasa, Malwa region, Indore and Ujjain. So the way that I look at the Bharatiya traditions is essentially what he has quoted in one of his kavyas called Madhavikagni Mitra. He says, Purana mityeva nasadhu sarvam nachapi kavyam navamitya vadhyam santah parikshant yatarat bhajante mudah parapratyayane buddhihi. Basically what he is trying to say is, just because something is old, it is not gold. Something is old, it is not to be revered just because it is old. Just because something is new, it is not to be discarded. Things have to be looked at based on the merit and examined, and based on the merit and then accepted whatever the things are. So essentially it is that kind of a critical shraddha and the reverence that we want to have towards even the Bharatiya perspective, and then examine it. Because he says, Santah parikshant yatarat bhajante, that is the way of the wise. Whereas the way of the mudhas is they will be led by the opinions of others. So let's take a look at what is basically that we are trying to talk. The motivation for this essentially talk, when Amrendra Prabhuji had told me about this, is that essentially this is something very close to my heart. And these are some of the trends, what we call as mega trends that are happening around the world. First thing is the physical reality that we live on a planet with limited amount of resources, whatever resources that you talk about. So we are essentially like that small ecosystem in a glass jar. That's how fragile we are. And if you remember that Carl Sagan's pale blue dot picture, that's essentially where we are, tiny speck of dust in the entire universe. And what are these megatrends? We are seeing the megatrends are those kind of trends which individually, even as individuals or as governments or even as countries, we cannot really change. These are things that are changing. And that is, for example, the global population, how that population is increasing, the demographic profiles are changing and things like that. The energy consumption, the climate change that is happening, and then health and information, how information is acceleration. There is an acceleration in the information access that is there. And then how the global order, geopolitics is basically shifting from the Western Europe again back to the Asia after so many centuries. And then we are essentially living in what we call as Anthropocene. These are the kind of challenges that we are facing, and I don't really need to tell you all of these challenges that we are facing, because world is essentially being the global systems, whether we talk about the natural cycles, they are all being influenced in a huge way by the activities of the human beings. And therefore, we are in Anthropocene. And then, for example, these are the kind of, some of the, if you go into nuances of the mega trends, global population is increasing, world will age as we go forward to 2047 and later to 2100, but then it will age unevenly. And that is something to be looked at. And then the patterns of diseases will change. And food production has to increase, but then we also have to worry about the wastage. 1/3 of the food is actually wasted. And then the global interconnections will increase with all the consequences about the communicable diseases, all of those things. And then shift in the global order is going to take place. And then scarce, when we talk about resources, there will be increased competition for limited resources. Fossil fuels will continue to dominate the energy matrix until we switch them back. And it is that transition is not going to happen in 5-10 years. It is going to take at least 40 to 50 years. And economics and not population will drive the consumption patterns. And this is something very fundamental to us. As India moves from low income to middle and upper middle income countries, we need to think about all of these things. And environmental change, when we talk about climate change, increasingly we will see it as variable weather. What used to be a 50-year or a 100-year flood now happens every 5 years. That's essentially something that will happen. And pollution is increasing. And these are the trends that we need to address. And we have some existential challenges like this. When we talk about the world in 2047, we have Amrit Kal, but we also will be in a world with 10 billion people. How do we feed 10 billion people? From the amount of, the land is not increasing. So how do we feed all of those people? Because if you think about it, this is what one of the things that bothered me so much that I could not sleep for 2 days in around 2013 or 14. This is just a question to all of you. If we stop the crop production today, how many years do you think we'll be able to feed the global population? Just take a guess. Month? Years? 90 days. Very close. 90 days, that's it. And so think about how fragile our situation is. And in a world where we are increasingly optimizing the supply chain logistics, even a small disruption in one place can have ripple effects and can cause massive social basically disorder and upheavals everywhere in the world. So this is the kind of things. So what has led to that is essentially these current models of development, because they are actually unsustainable, fragile, and are directly in conflict with the nature. These are all the sustainable development goals of the UN. Most of you are familiar with this. There are 17 goals and things like that. And normally when we talk about sustainability, we talk about three aspects to it. We talk about the economic aspects, we talk about the environmental aspects, and then the social aspects. And then there is also that discipline of ecological economics by combining the economics and the ecosystem services, essentially. But then I want to throw something like, as they say in cricket terminology, a googly at you. Is this something that, is the concept of sustainability sufficient? Because, see, we are talking about irreversible changes and limitations. And then if you think about that, heard about that Limits to Growth 1972 paper, that essentially talks about how the trajectories of the consumption and all were unsustainable. And there was a 30-year and a 40-year update to that report. And what basically they have shown is these trajectories of consumption, resource use patterns have not changed. In fact, they have become worse. We are increasingly consuming more and more resources. And then what is it that we want to sustain then? That is a question to ask. Because sustainability, if you notice the 1987 Brundtland Commission report and then the definition of that, it was to sustain the lifestyle as it is. But then can you sustain what is essentially an unsustainable path? Is a fundamental question we all need to ask. Because we are saying that we want to be sustainable. What do we mean by sustainability? Is it maintaining this kind of a life? No, not really, because this kind of a life is not sustainable. And this is essentially a report from Nature Reviews, where they have shown, you can see the red bars basically. They are all the boundaries that we have already exceeded, for the planetary boundaries that we have already exceeded. And this is 2022, and 2018, it was only 3 of them that had been exceeded. So every 5 years, we are exceeding more and more of these boundaries. So it is in that context, then people came up with these concepts of resilience. And then said, we need to really think about resilience. And it is not, sustainability is not enough. And what is resilience? Really, essentially the capacity to persist in the face of change. And continue to be the original system that we are. And then it variously relates to adaptability, transformability, and so on and so forth. But basically all of this was informed from Holling's research in ecological systems in 1973 and things like that. Essentially, they saw that in ecosystems, there are multiple stable states. For example, if you want to see how a rainforest gets changed under variable weather, it will not turn into desert the next day. It probably goes through multiple stages, and then it may go back and forth, and suddenly there may be a tipping point that will tip the ecosystem. These are essentially the stability domains in ecosystems. Again, you can mathematically analyze it. There's a whole mathematical subject to that. You can actually identify when those transitions happen. And then from that, you also can learn how to prevent it. And just to give you some terminology, where do these terms come from? If you look at the word sustainability, it comes from the Latin word sub, that means to hold from below, and then tenere, to hold. So something to hold from below. Just imagine Bhagavan Sri Krishna holding the Govardhanagiri. That's essentially what it is. He's supporting something from the bottom, upholding that. That is essentially to sustain. And stability is essentially standing firm. And robustness comes from robustus, which means strong. Resilience comes from resilio, which means to rebound. So you perturb a system, it rebounds back to its original state and original function without losing its character. That is resilience. And fragility is, we are all familiar with that word fragile, something that is a tendency to break. And vulnerability is, vulnerus comes from that word vulnerus, which means injury. So these are some of the things that you will hear in these contexts when we talk about sustainability, resilience, and things like that. Why am I bringing this resilience and sustainability? I'll ask you to please hold this definition of sustainability in your mind. We'll come back to that towards the end of the presentation. And so there are these concepts of whether robustness, is it same as resilience? There is a lot of play of uncertainties, system boundaries, and feedbacks of systems. Because why is it that we want to have all of these things? Because in a complex system like Earth, there are many feedback loops which we'll have to basically cater to if we want to have some kind of a positive response on impact on the system itself. And in the short term, resilience is essentially something equal to robustness. And then in medium term, we call it as adaptability. And then in long term, we call it as transformability. How can you transform? These are the three things that you can think about in resilience. Now, imagine this in the context of the sustainability. Because now we said that sustainability is not enough, resilience is needed. So we'll have to think about in these terms in terms of how do we make our systems robust in the near term, adaptive in the medium term, and then transform them completely in the long term. That is what will enable us to really be survive as a species, really speaking. And there is something called law of fragility. If you make some part robust, you always make other part basically weak. And this is like if I give you some amount of material and I ask you to build a building, if you use more of it in one part, you'll be left with less in the other part. And this is essentially what happens even in the systems. In fact, that is what has happened with our food networks. In our pursuit of economic, basically profit maximization, what we have done is we have made the system fragile for the supply chain disruptions. And this is something that we need to think about. And this is essentially the kind of pictorial representation of what is it that we are trying to do. So we can have systems that are here in the center, perhaps. Oh, okay, maybe I can use this. Yeah. So you can have a system like this, as you can see in the center. And if you perturb it slowly, if that system is essentially what is called as a fragile system, after some time it will break, and then even with the same small perturbations in time, it will go from steady state 4 from that steady state 1. And then even that perturbation 1, which could have basically made the system to come back earlier, now makes it go to steady state 3. That red dot that you see is outside the system boundary. It's a change system. Whereas on the other hand, if you have something like a anti-fragile system, which is what Nicholas Nassim Taleb talks about in his Anti-Fragile book. This is also applicable to a lot of human systems and natural systems. So there, the small perturbations actually build resilience in the system, and then it actually becomes much more resilient. To give you a common example, so you take a piece of glass or a wire. This is a common thing that we all do, right? If you have to break a metallic wire, we try to twist it many times and then we break. That is essentially a fragile system. Whereas on the other hand, if you go to gym every day and then if you're lifting a 20-pound weight, after a week, you'll be able to lift a 25-pound weight because your system has adapted to that and has become more robust. That is an anti-fragile system. All of the natural systems are anti-fragile. But the point is, we cannot perturb them beyond a measure, and that's something that we need to think about. And how are we addressing all of these problems? Even today, we are like the 6 blind men. And economists don't talk to engineers don't talk to scientists, and then there is no, especially people like Raman Kanji, nobody even talks to them. And then these are all, how do we relate from lab to the land and land to the lab? This is a big disconnect and something to think about. And then this is where we need to take the systems perspective. And whenever we talk about a solution, we first must think that again, as the lion makers, first do no harm. We don't want to come up with fixes that will fail. Again, this is a classic system archetype, and we want to move beyond resilience to anti-fragile. We want to make systems that are anti-fragile. And this is where we can think about nature. Nature is complex, but is not complicated. And how do we want to do? Basically, we want to manage and not solve nature's problems. We are too small to solve all the nature's problems. We just have to thrive with it, and that's what we need to really look at. Try, learn, and adapt. That's really the complexity mindset that we talk about. Now, this is where we talk about Indian way. Is there an Indian way? I think there is an Indian way. And this is where Indian knowledge systems comes into play. What is Indian knowledge systems? Essentially, it is the Jivana Darshana, the Jnana and the Vijnana that Bharatiyas had developed based on their interactions with the world in Indian subcontinent. And that is expressed as the Drishti, the Indian perspective. That makes the perspective uniquely Indian. And then the Parampara, the knowledge transfer. And then the Laukika Prayojana, the value of that for this world. And basically, I will just go to this one and then say, what is this uniqueness that we talk about? And I think we look at reality in three levels: Adhyatmika, Adhibhautika, and Adhidaivika. Then there are four goals of life which we all talk about: Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. And then we have the four ashramas, which are four stages of life. And then we also talk about the circularity of time. Essentially, everything happens in cycles rather than a linear time. This, along with the Purushartha framework and the Varnashrama framework, and ability to look at the reality in three levels, ensures that we don't disconnect the sacred. We actually look at the sacred and the mundane in one continuum, and we don't separate that. So everything for us is, as Ramakant ji was saying, it becomes a puja. Whether we are in a puja room or outside, it becomes a puja for us. It becomes sacred for us. Whatever the stage of life we are in, it becomes these are the four goals to be pursued, along with this idea of karma that comes from this circularity. And what does that lead to? Essentially, it leads to performance of sadharma, and nishkama karma will lead to loka sangraha, as Bhagavan Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita. And that essentially is also going to lead to the moksha, chaturtha purushartha. And this is essentially in loka sangraha is the word that is used in Bhagavad Gita. And then rashtra sangraha is the word that is used in Manusmriti for the same thing. And Ramakrishna Mission has this Dhyayavakya, Atmano Mokshardham Jagathitaya cha. These are all the frameworks that we have. I will just say one thing, because we are staying in NSC, I'll just take one example of economics. Capitalism talks about pure profit maximization, Shuddha Labh. Opposite of that is complete negation of profit and killing of the entrepreneurship, as you will see in communism. The Bharatiya way is not Shuddha Labh of capitalism or Shunya Labh of communism. It is Shubha Labh. Labh for me, but Shubha for the welfare for the world. And that is a model that we need to think about. And that essentially has things that will ensure that the excesses of both the systems don't come up. And then we actually can work for an aspirational India, as Swamiji was saying, that will have the basically address all the eightfold wealth creation. And with that, I'll stop here and then just say that the Swadharma, Nishkama Karma, combining that, we can essentially go into the Loka Sangraha, and that will lead to the Moksha. And this is where essentially the Bharatiya Drishti comes in, where we come up with what Ishavasya Upanishad begins with. Ishavasyamidam sarvam yatkincha jagatyam jagat tena tyaktena bunjida maghruda kasvasiddhanam. We are not talking about negation of the world. We are talking about living the life to the fullest, but at the same time thriving with nature and not getting away from the paradigm of knowledge is power to the what Bhagavad Gita says, knowledge is the greatest purifier, so that we identify ourselves, see the divine in everything that we are, and ultimately go to the fourth Purushartha. Namaste. Dhanyavada.